Welcome students to our first video lesson. This lesson takes the place of the class that we've lost due to the snow day on February the 24th. For this class, you will need your study questions for an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, your study questions for to build a fire, a couple sheets of paper, and something to write with. We're going to start with a wrap-up for Realism and Naturalism, which we've been studying the past few weeks. Ambrose Bierce is the writer that you studied last week who wrote An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. You'll need a sheet of paper to take down a few notes about Bierce's life, and these facts are about to come up on the screen for you, so just get your paper and something to write with. If you need to pause the video, then please do that at this time. Here is a picture of Ambrose Bierce. He lived from 1842 until 1914. He was a journalist. He was known for his Civil War short stories. He was nicknamed Bitter Bierce because he tended to be quite cynical. He wrote the Devil's Dictionary, and this was not a satanic work, but a cynical one, where he redefines common words with a giant dose of skepticism. An example of this would be his definition for the word love, in which he describes it as an insanity curable only by marriage. So you can see in that his skepticism about love and also some of his humor as well. Bierce had a very mysterious death. He decided that he was going to run off and join the war in Mexico, and he wrote a letter when he left saying that if he never came back, that he would consider his death better than falling down the cellar stairs. And as a matter of fact, he never was heard from again. So we think he died in 1914, but again, there's a lot of mystery around his death, and we're not exactly sure when he died, but he was 71 years old, the last he was ever heard from. So a very interesting character. All right, now we're going to go over the questions for An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. So you'll need to take those questions out, and I'm going to basically go over the answers for those questions, and you should be checking your questions. I hope you like the picture of this bridge because you'll be looking at it for a little while. On your questions, go ahead and fill in your author. It's Ambrose Bierce. Your literary device that's focused on in this story is point of view. And so let's just go through and check these. All right, the story is set in Alabama. When the story opens, there's about to be a hanging, a military execution, as a matter of fact, to punish a criminal. And the participants in the scene basically are all of the military. We have some sentinels on either end of the bridge. We have the man who's being hanged. We have a lieutenant there as well. And so basically the bridge is being guarded on either end so that this execution can take place. All right, death is personified in this story. This is number 3 as a dignitary. Because this is a very formal scene, and there are all sorts of signs of respect being paid here because there is an execution about to take place. The man who is being hanged is a gentleman. It describes him not as like a common criminal, but a gentleman. He's described as being a planner. The way he's described always reminds me of Colonel Sanders with the hair and the suit and all. What is ironic when it describes the liberal military code that's being used here is that usually liberal and military do not go hand in hand. It's almost like an oxymoron because military is usually very strict and liberal is usually very lax, and so quite an oxymoron there. All right, so the man who's being hanged in this story, he's standing there on the bridge, and the way that this is going to work out as far as his death is that he's standing on a plank, and the military officer standing on the other end of the plank, and the plank is kind of teetering like a seesaw over the edge of the bridge, so that when the military man steps away, then the man being hanged is going to kind of teeter down and he'll fall, and that's the way in which he will be hanged. But as he's standing there waiting for this to happen, knowing that this military man is about to step off the plank and that he will be hanged, he does get very distracted. He knows that his time is very limited. And what first distracts him is a piece of driftwood floating down the river. He tries his very best to think about his wife and his family, but then his thoughts are distracted a second time by a metallic pounding sound, which he later realizes to be his wife and metallic sound, which he later realizes to be his watch. And probably the reason that the watch is so emphasized at that point is because his time is very limited right now. He's just about to die, and so that just the ticking of his watch is almost excruciating as he waits for each second to tick by. The last thoughts that flash through his mind are thoughts of escape, which would probably flash through anyone's mind as they're awaiting their execution. The man who is about to be hanged is Peyton Farquhar. And right here in the story, we have kind of a little shift that builds suspense. We're just waiting and watching to see what will happen with this man. And then suddenly it shifts to give us some background to how he ended up there. Again, his name is Peyton Farquhar, and it does describe his lifestyle and his personality. Again, he's not a common criminal. He is a planter, and he lives a pretty wealthy and privileged lifestyle. And he had wanted to be a soldier, but it says that there are things that prevented him from doing that, and so he is going to instead try to help out the cause of the war in any way that he can. So in this section of the story, a soldier comes up, and Peyton Farquhar and his wife both assume that this soldier is a Southern soldier, and they jump up and want to be able to help him. Peyton Farquhar wants to find out information about what's going on and how he can stop the advance of the troops, and his wife wants to serve the soldier and make sure that he's taken care of. But this Peyton Farquhar, when he begins to ask questions, he asks questions about what someone could do if they wanted to stop the advance of the soldiers. And the soldier tells him that the troops have gotten as far as the Owl Creek Bridge, and there's only one guard there, and that there is a lot of driftwood and things piled up, and that the bridge would probably burn down very easily if someone were to set fire to it. And so this kind of gives us the hint that perhaps this is what Peyton Farquhar will do. And then later on, the soldier says that there was a warning that if anyone interfered with the bridge, they would be hanged. And so the fact that Peyton Farquhar is being hanged at the beginning of the story, and he's gotten this information that the bridge could be burned down to stop the advance of the Yankees, and we know too that he wanted to help the Southern cause. So all those things kind of give us the information we need to know that what Peyton Farquhar did is he interfered with the bridge in some way, and that's why he's being hanged at the very beginning of the story. All right, at the end of that section, we see that, we see throughout that Peyton Farquhar thought that this soldier was a Southern soldier, but at the end of the section, it says that the soldier turned back north and he was a Federal scout. And so this man was not who Peyton Farquhar thought he was. All right, now we go back to Peyton Farquhar's hanging, and the first sensation that he becomes aware of in Section 3 is just an excruciating pain and fullness and congestion as a result of the hanging, just a terrible pain in his neck. And when his thought is restored, he realizes that the rope has snapped. And when he realizes that, he's pretty shocked by it, as you can imagine. And then what happens to his senses become very, very acute as a result of this. And the soldiers, of course, eventually see him because, they were in the process of hanging him. And then the rope snapped. And so when they see him, they begin to fire at him. And so Peyton Farquhar dives down as far as he can underwater to escape the firings of the soldiers. So this is basically like at a fort where they are, and they're all lined up on the bank, just basically, shooting at him. And so he does dive down as far as he can underwater in order to escape. All right, and he does eventually get his hands loose, and then he's able to get the rope off his neck. And then he's in terrible agony after having done that, and so he does scream out, and of course that alerts the attention of the soldiers so they know where to shoot. But in any case, as we just talked about, his senses are very, very acute. He's able to see the people shooting at him. He's able to even see the color of the eye of one of the marksmen, a gray eye, who's firing at him. And so it's pretty miraculous that he manages to get away. They even fire a cannon at him at one point, and then he gets caught up in a whirlpool and tossed out on the ground. And he is so relieved to be there. He says that the ground could have just been made of rubies and emeralds because he cherishes it so much to finally be on the ground and to be seemingly safe, that he thinks he can escape at this point. All right, and he talks about how the wind is blowing and he just lies there behind a rock. They can't see him. They do send out one final charge of grape, which is a bunch of little cannonballs at him, but he manages to escape that as well, which again is pretty miraculous. He begins his journey home, and he describes the journey home. This is a very seems unforeign territory, even though this is where his home is. It's odd that it's so foreign, and he seems to hear whispers out in the woods, and he doesn't really recognize the stars in the sky, the constellations that he sees there. And but nonetheless, he makes his journey home. Toward the end of it, he gets so tired that he can barely even feel the ground under his feet. And then right at the end of the story, suddenly it's like almost like he had been dreaming, because he loses consciousness, and then he sees his wife and he reaches for her, and then right whenever he reaches for her, he feels a stunning blow at the back of his neck. And the surprise ending for the story, for question number 16, is that he basically has been hanged. That stunning blow that he felt at the back of the neck was his neck breaking, and this whole escape was all just a dream. He just pretty much envisioned all of that. His last thoughts were about escape, and then he just created this whole escape in his mind, reaching for his wife, making it home, and all of that was all just a dream. Now, if you look back through the story, this is for number 17, there is evidence in the story that this was in fact all a dream. And I think if you think about it, all these things were pretty much unrealistic. The idea of him being the rope breaking, for one, the fact that they could be shooting at him, that he would be able to escape the bullets, that they would be firing cannons, he'd be able to escape that he would get caught up in a whirlpool and then tossed out. His really acute senses, the fact that he was able to see the gray eye of the marksman through the scope, the ground seeming like rubies and emeralds, and the wind blowing. It said almost like the sound of Aeolian harps. It's almost like he was in heaven. And then, of course, his journey home was very unusual. I mean, he's lived there his whole life, and yet it seemed like an unfamiliar territory. Constellations seemed unfamiliar. He heard unfamiliar voices whispering in an unknown language in the woods. And so just a lot of things in the story that reveal to us that this is not realistic. And keep in mind, too, that this story was written in the era of realism. And so that means that it should be just like giving a slice of life, and everything should just be very realistic. And yet, so many of these details in the story were not realistic. That's another big, huge clue that this was, in fact, all a dream. It really did not happen. And if you're looking just at this as a work of realism, what really did happen in the story is that a man, tried to participate in a war to help out the Southern cause, and he got caught doing that, and so the military followed their rules, which is that they executed him. And while we may have hoped for his escape, that obviously did not happen. He was punished, and that was the end of the story. Again, a very fit ending, appropriate ending for a story of realism. All right, so now we'll be transitioning to our next author, and that author is Jack London. Now, while we just saw an example of realism with Bitter Bierce's occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, this story that we'll be studying by Jack London is a story of naturalism. So a little bit about Jack London's life. He lived from 1876 to 1916. He was part of the working class. He worked a variety of jobs, including shoveling coal and oyster pirating. He was best known for his novels Call of the Wild and White Fang. To Build a Fire, which you read, is his most famous short story. He expressed his socialist views in much of his work, and he also expressed his belief in survival of the fittest. Unlike many of the authors that we studied, he did become a millionaire due to his writing. However, his life did have a very sad ending. He had been building a mansion called Wolf House, and that burned to the ground, and then he lapsed into a coma from kidney failure, which was due to his alcoholism. And as you can see there, he was only like 40 years old when he died. Okay, so here's a picture of Jack London, and then here is a picture of his, picture from his famous short story, To Build a Fire. And so you will need to take out those questions now for To Build a Fire and have those handy. All right, so the first question here says, why does the tremendous cold make no impression on the man? Okay, the tremendous cold makes no impression on him. It describes him as being a very unimaginative man, and of course that status as being unimaginative is going to come into play later in the story. And so that's why it makes no impression on him. He doesn't think about, wow, it's really cold, this could happen, this could kill me. Instead, he tends to be very prideful and not use his imagination to think about all the potential downfalls of being out in the cold. How does he become aware that it's colder than 50 below? He becomes aware because he spits, and when he spits, the spit freezes in the air. The actual temperature here is actually more like 75 degrees below zero. The dog's awareness of the cold is different from the man's awareness of the cold because the dog has lived in this environment for a really long time. His ancestors have lived in this environment for a really long time. The man is a newcomer to the area. The dog just really knows this cold from it being, kind of bred into him for, a very long time. And this is going to bring up that survival of the fittest that you'll see throughout this story, which was a main theme that Jack London liked to write on, because the dog has kind of been bred to this environment and the man has not. All right, the man is very careful while he's traveling. Even though he's a newcomer, he knows that he does not need to get his feet wet in this cold weather, and so he's careful to avoid these little ice skins, which are just little puddles that are covered over with ice, and if he steps in them, his feet will get wet, and then he has the potential of getting frostbite and losing some of his toes. Who knows, it might even be unable to go any further to travel, and then that would, possibly end in his death. So he's careful to avoid these ice skins. He uses the dog to test for these. He basically kind of shoos the dog ahead of him, and then to see if the ice will, break through. And if it does, of course, the man knows to take another path. The man, even though he's trying to be very careful, he does eventually step into one of these ice skins. He does get his feet wet, and he does then have the need to build a fire in order to dry out his feet. Unfortunately, though, he makes a very careless mistake. This tied as well to maybe his lack of imagination that was mentioned in the beginning of the story. He builds the fire under a tree, and then, of course, when the fire thaws out the snow in the tree, it causes an avalanche that then puts out his fire. He's then prevented from building a fire because he really had not gotten, completely thawed out with the fire, and so now his hands are freezing, his feet are freezing, and he's sure that he's going to have some pretty terrible frostbite, and that is going to be the best case scenario. He now really is in a life or death situation. This putting out of the fire is really the climax of the story, because throughout the story he's thought about, this advice that this old timer at Sulphur Creek had given him about not traveling by himself in below 50 degree weather, and yet the man has been able to do this, and he continues to encourage himself throughout the walk. This is going to be fine. I'll be fine without somebody here as my companion. Just the dog. And yet here he is now, when the fire is put out by the snow, he realizes at that point, it's why it's the climax of the story, that he should have had a traveling partner, that now he's in real danger because his hands are freezing. He's going to have an extremely difficult time building a fire with freezing hands. And as a matter of fact, there's a great deal of detail at that point in the story showing how just grueling it is. It's just such a memorable section of that story when he's trying his very best just to do something so simple as strike a match. And yet his fingers are so numb that he can't pull apart and separate out one match. And then he tries to use the whole stack, and he ends up trying to put it in his mouth, hold the stack of matches in his mouth, and then the sulfur, goes up his nose and causes him to cough, and, he's unable to do it. He's unable to start a fire. And so he has several other ideas here to try to save himself. One of them pretty gruesome, the idea of trying to catch the dog and, cut him open and put his hands inside to thaw them out so that he can then, start a fire. Of course, the dog has instinct to go on, unlike the man, and so the dog, when the man, begins to talk kindly to him and call him to him in a kind voice, the dog realizes that something is wrong with the man, that he's never spoken to him in that kind voice before, and so he's mainly only known the whip and kind of a cruel yell, and so he runs from the man and is able to survive. The man also tries to run, and perhaps he can get to camp that way, but eventually he decides that he wants to die with dignity, and so he sits down at the end of the story, and he kind of has a variety of thoughts going through his head about how his friends will come and find him the next day. They've been waiting on him at the camp that he'll never make it to, so he sits down and basically freezes to death. After a little while, the dog smells, it says, the stench of death, and so he runs back to the camp. He realizes that there are other fire givers at the camp. and that there's the man that he's been with is going to be able to do nothing else for him, and so he does leave him. It's not like those stories that we see, where the dog runs out with the flask of hot chocolate, or those stories that we see about how the dog stays until the very end, or lies there on the grave. This dog goes back to where he can survive. And so for that was question number 6. What happens to the man at the end of the story? And B, how does the dog react? The man dies. The dog goes back to camp where he can survive. How would we characterize the man's relationship with the dog? Well, obviously, this is a relationship that is not really a kind one. They've just worked together, and it's not like there's a lot of affection there. Instead, it's kind of a harsh relationship. The man's relationship with nature is different from the dog's relationship with nature. The man, obviously goes out in nature because he's got some things to do as far as looking at timber that's down, and so he's got a task that he's doing here. And unfortunately, he's not too wise about how to survive in nature. He's not really built and doesn't really have, the long line of history with nature like the dog does. Excuse me. And so therefore, the man is not able to survive in this environment, but the dog is. And that answers letter C also. The dog is definitely better equipped to survive in nature than the man is. And again, this reflects Jack London's survival of the fittest beliefs. How do the man's recollections of his conversation with the old man at Sulphur Creek foreshadow the end of the story? Well, the old man said in the beginning, and our narrator's remembering that it is not wise to travel with someone, or to travel out in weather below 50 degrees, below zero, without a traveling companion. And so this man does that, and you can see that the old timer at Sulphur Creek was right, because our narrator does not survive. He does not follow that advice, and he does not survive. Now, number 9 says, why do you think that London chose not to give the man in the story a name? Because mainly he's talking about man in general. This is a story of naturalism. It has a pretty bleak outlook on life, and there's the idea, of course, in naturalism that man's destiny is determined by his heredity. In this particular case, it lets us know early on that this man was not very imaginative, and so his destiny was really kind of set by that. It's what he inherited. He did not inherit the instinct and the same qualities that the dog had, and so therefore his destiny is pretty much set. And so London is saying this about all of mankind. And it's kind of the same idea that we saw in the Pearl. Kino was in the lower echelon of society, and that's what he inherited. That's where his people came from, a long line of ancestry behind him in that same echelon of society. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not break out of that. Same situation here. The man in the story just represents any man. Jack London was making a point that man is not well equipped to survive in these harsh conditions, because we have not inherited the instinct, the types of things that the dog has in order to survive here. And so that also answers number 10 as well. What does the story suggest about humanity's place in nature? We have kind of a limited place in nature. We cannot survive in extreme conditions like this animal can. All right. So moving along now from To Build a Fire, you can go ahead and put those questions aside. You will need to take back out your paper that you've been using for notes, because now we're going to be talking about Thornton Wilder. He is our first modern writer that we will be studying. If you'll recall, you did a PowerPoint this past week about modernism, so you took down some notes about modernism. Thornton Wilder, again, is going to be our first modern writer that we'll study. He actually is both a playwright and a novelist. He lived from 1897 to 1975. As I mentioned, he's remembered as an American playwright and novelist. He did win 3 Pulitzer Prizes. One of those was for his play, Our Town. Our Town is set in a town called Grover's Corners. So that should give you a little bit of background, and we are about to start this play. So basically this video tied up all the loose ends that we had with naturalism and realism, in our study of To Build a Fire and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Again, 2 very um, popular works of realism. And so now we're going to be moving into the modern realm with Thornton Wilder and his play Our Town. The main characters come from two families. There's the Gibbs and the Webb families. Here's a picture from the play. The Gibbs family consists of Dr. and Mrs. Gibbs and George and Rebecca. And then there's the Webb family that consists of Mr. and Mrs. Webb, Emily, and George. And then the play consists of three main acts. There's daily life, love and marriage, and death and loss. Okay, one more detail that I want to point out and I'd like you to add to your notes about the play Our Town, and you can see this well in the picture. This work is a work of modern drama, and there were some differences with modern drama than drama in the past. And so modern drama, and this play in particular is a good example of it, does not use a lot of props and scenery. And you can see in this that these characters are up on a ladder. In one particular scene, there's going to be a cemetery, and basically instead of having tombstones and a lot of elaborate setting and backdrop to show that it's a cemetery, there are characters sitting in chairs, and that's supposed to be the extent of it. There will be scenes where you'll see the family at work, and the mom's in the kitchen, and they'll be cooking, and yet they're really not. They're pretending to hold like bowls and spoons, but they're really not holding anything. And so just props and backdrop and scenery are all very limited in this modern play. You also have a narrator in this play. He's called the stage manager, and so he will comment on certain parts of the play and kind of give some background at other parts. And you'll also have places where the play has shifts in time, where you'll go into the future and you'll go into the past. And so those abrupt shifts in time are also part of modern drama. Modernism in general is very fragmented, and so that's conveyed in drama as well by these abrupt shifts in time. And so that pretty much ties up our background for Our Town and our first video lesson. You will be getting your assignments on Tuesday night tonight, and so please do check Edline for those. A majority of that will consist of your study of Our Town, where you'll be watching some of that from YouTube and completing some questions. Also, you'll begin working on your biographical section of your research paper, so you'll be using your note cards to write that section, and also I will post a sample paper for you to look at. All right, email me if you have any questions, and stay warm.